34 men failed 0 drug tests. Not one. Not once. And every single one of them lost an entire year of their careers anyway. Meanwhile, the man who built the entire program that put them there walked away with nothing but a piece of paper telling him he could never work in sport again, a punishment he'd already stopped caring about by the time it arrived. This is the story of Australian sport's strangest doping scandal. A scandal with no positive test. A scandal where the science couldn't prove what anyone actually took. And a scandal that ended with the players, the ones with the least power in the entire building, paying the only real price. By the end of this, you'll understand how a football club convinced itself that the rules didn't apply to it, how one coach's obsession with being ahead of the competition opened a door nobody should have walked through, and how the punishment, when it finally came, landed on almost exactly the wrong people. This is the strangest scandal in Australian sport. It didn't start with a scandal. It started with a football club falling behind. Go back to 2010. A proud old Victorian club had just finished its coach of 11 years, replacing him with one of its own greatest former players. A young, ambitious appointment brought in to modernize everything. Fresh ideas. Fresh energy. A promise to catch up to clubs that had pulled ahead on fitness science and recovery. Within a year, a new performance coach joined the staff, brought in from a club down the highway that had already built a reputation for pushing sports science further than anyone else in the competition. He suggested bringing in a specialist he'd worked with before, a sports scientist with a growing reputation for aggressive, cutting-edge supplement programs. That sports scientist was hired in November 2011. He was given near-total control over a new injection program for the playing group. And almost immediately, things started moving faster than anyone back at head office fully understood. What followed was not one supplement. It was dozens, pills, intravenous vitamin drips, and a rotating menu of injections given to players sometimes multiple times a week, often away from the club's own medical facilities. 38 players agreed to take part. They signed consent forms telling them the substances were compliant with international anti-doping rules. Almost none of them asked a second question. Why would they? Their own club had told them it was safe. But 2 months in, the club's own doctor, the one man whose job was literally to know what was going into these players' bodies, started asking questions nobody wanted to answer. He hadn't approved several of the substances being used. He wasn't being told what was actually in the injections. In January 2012, he put his concerns in writing. This program, he warned, was playing at the very edge of what was legal, and could read extremely badly for the club if it ever became public. He was right. He just didn't know how right. Because the truth was, the doctor had been sidelined from the very process he was supposed to be overseeing. For decades, one man had signed off on everything that entered a player's body at this club. Now there was a second chain of command, running in parallel, answering to almost no one. And the player group, the people actually receiving these injections, had no real way of knowing that the two systems had quietly split apart. Here's the detail that makes this story different from almost every other scandal in Australian sport. Nobody at the club stopped the program because of what the doctor said. It kept running for months afterward. The players, for their part, were told to keep the injections confidential, framed to them as protecting a competitive advantage, not hiding something illegal. So they said nothing. Test after test, they were asked directly whether they'd taken any supplements. Test after test, none of them declared the injections. Not because they were hiding banned drugs, because, as far as they understood it, there was nothing to hide. By May 2012, the program was finally shut down internally. But it was too late to matter. The moment had already passed where this could stay a private club problem. Think about what that means. For 4 months after the club's own doctor put his concerns in writing, the injections continued. Nobody pulled the plug the moment a warning landed on paper. The program only stopped once it had already run its course, once whatever was going to happen to those players' bodies had already happened. In February 2013, the club took the extraordinary step of going to the league and the National Anti-Doping Authority itself, asking for an investigation into its own supplements program. 2 days later, in Canberra, senior government ministers stood alongside sporting officials to announce something far bigger than one football club. Organised crime, they said, was infiltrating Australian sport through doping and match fixing. The press immediately branded it the strangest scandal in Australian sport. And the club at the centre of it hadn't even been accused of anything yet. It had simply raised its own hand. What came next was not a quick resolution. It was 16 months of investigation, followed by 3 more years of hearings, appeals, and reversals that would make this the longest-running scandal in the history of the code. In August 2013, the league handed down its verdict on the club itself, a $2 million fine, a ban from that year's final series, and suspensions for the coach and the football operations manager. Heavy penalties. But notice what's missing. No player had been charged with anything. Whether any banned substance had actually entered anyone's body was still, officially, unproven. It took until June 2014, 16 months after the investigation began, for the Anti-Doping Authority to formally act against the players themselves. 34 past and present players were issued notices alleging they'd been given a specific banned peptide. Not because a single one of them had ever tested positive for it. Because investigators believed, from paperwork and testimony, that it was probably what they'd been injected with. Think about that for a moment. Of the players tested repeatedly throughout the season in question, every single test came back clean. The case against them wasn't built on what was found in their bodies. It was built on what investigators believed had gone into a room they were never really allowed to fully understand. Patient consent forms, text messages, invoices from a compounding chemist, and testimony from a sports scientist whose own account of events kept shifting every time he was asked to repeat it. That's the part of this story that almost never makes the highlight reel. This wasn't a case of catching cheats red-handed. It was a case built entirely out of paperwork, inference, and the word of men who couldn't agree with each other, let alone with themselves. In March 2015, the league's own anti-doping tribunal delivered its verdict, not guilty. All 34 players, cleared. For a moment, it looked like this genuinely was over. That 2 years of an entire playing group's lives being picked apart had ended in exoneration. It lasted 7 weeks. The World Anti-Doping Agency appealed the decision to the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Switzerland. And in January 2016, almost 3 full years after that first press conference, the Swiss court overturned the not guilty verdict entirely. The players were found to have violated anti-doping rules. Backdated bans, expiring between November 2016 and February 2017, were handed to all 34. 12 of them were still on the club's list. They would miss the entire coming season for a violation the court itself admitted it couldn't prove through science or testing. The ruling rested on circumstantial evidence, not one confirmed positive sample. Here's where the story leaves you with a question nobody in this saga has ever fully answered. The sports scientist who built and ran the program received a lifetime ban from involvement in the sport, a serious penalty on paper, for a man who by then had already been effectively frozen out of the industry regardless. The coach who oversaw the club during those years resigned in 2015, before the final verdict even came down, and never coached at the elite level again. But the 34 men who actually paid the price in the way that mattered most, a full season stolen from careers that don't last forever, were the ones furthest from the decisions that created the program in the first place. Told it was legal. Told to keep it quiet for competitive reasons, not because it was against the rules. Tested constantly, and never once caught with anything in their system. They served their bans anyway. Every one of them. So ask yourself the question this entire saga leaves hanging. If the science never proved what was actually injected, if the players never failed a single test, if even the tribunal built to judge them first said not guilty, what, exactly, were 34 men actually being punished for? Maybe it was never really about proof at all. Maybe it was about a club that broke its own culture of trust so badly that someone had to pay for it, and the only people left standing close enough to blame were the ones who'd simply done what they were told. That's the strangest scandal in Australian sport. Not the headline from 2013. The quiet, unresolved question sitting underneath it, that nobody in charge ever had to answer. If a story like this, where the punishment and the proof don't line up, is the kind of Australian sports history you want more of, subscribe. Next time on Aussienatics, we go back inside the Blood Money series, for a scandal where an entire dynasty had its trophies erased, and almost nobody who built the fraud ever answered for it either.